Hello and welcome to the second webinar about the historic town of Dunster. My name's Lizzie Induni and I'm a trustee for the Somerset Archaeological and Natural History Society, more commonly called SANHS. I'm also chair of the Historic Buildings Committee of SANHS. Today we're going to hear a lecture by local historian Barbara Hoffbauer, who will take us through a tour through Dunster's recorded history from 1066 till the present day. The lecture will be the second in the series for SANHS and will be recorded for future use. If you've any thoughts or queries about the lecture, you can send in questions by activating a questions and answer button, a Q&A button, at the bottom of the page and typing in a message. To find the button, just run the mouse over the bottom of your screen and a series of buttons should pop up. If the button's not there, it might be at the top right or even hidden under 3 dots. At the end of the lecture, I will field particularly interesting questions to Barbara, who will be able to respond. Any questions submitted will go on record in the recording, but we won't mention people's names. If you're enjoying the lecture, which is free, you might want to give a donation to SANHS. The donations button is on our online exhibition page on the SANHS website. You will also be able to read more about the early Dunster Project and further webinars that we may be hosting. There also will be videos to watch, and we'll also add bits to the exhibits on the coming weeks ahead. A link to that webpage will be posted at the end of the webinar in the Zoom chat button. The chat button's next to the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, or it might be under the 3 dots menu. Our lecturer today is Barbara Hoffbauer. Barbara lives in Dunster and is an active member of the early Dunster Project team, and she's been focusing mainly on the house history. She's also one of the walk leaders for Dunster Village Walks, which are organised by Exmoor National Park. And she's also involved with the Dunster Museum. Barbara was born in Porlock, and her lifelong interest in history began when she was a pupil at Minehead School in the 1960s. Since returning to live in the area 6 years ago, she's immersed herself in Dunster's fascinating history, with particular interest in the ordinary people who lived and worked there. So, over to you, Barbara.
Welcome to Dunster, everyone. We usually start our village walks here at the National Park Centre on Dunster Steep, and that seems a very good place for us to start today.
So we're here in the visitor centre, where we've got this wonderful mural giving us an artist's impression of what Dunster High Street might have been like on the 11th of May 1500. If you've been to Dunster, it's a scene that seems fairly familiar, although there are quite a lot of differences. Here at the end of the street on the hill, we've got the castle, but not at all the castle as we would know it now. And at this end of the street, there's something missing. The yarn market isn't here. That wasn't built for about another 100 years, and it stands roughly where this line crosses. In the middle of the street, at the end of the market stalls, is this building that's now been demolished, and that was the old courthouse. Records from the courthouse from the 11th of May 1500 tell us that Richard Morgan and John Claren were each fined 6pence for brawling, and on the same day George Escott was fined 3pence for selling underweight bread. So what we're going to do in the course of our talk today is think about how did Dunster come to be this busy, bustling place in 1500, and what happened afterwards to get us to where we are today.
Our story begins back in 1066 at the Battle of Hastings. Amongst the knights who fought alongside William the Conqueror was one called William de Mohun. He must have put up a pretty good show, because when spoils were divided, he was awarded over 70 manors in the southwest of England, and almost half of them in our part of Somerset, including Dunster. Now, the Domesday Book tells us at the time Dunster wasn't really that much to write home about. It was a very small manor in terms of its size and the people living here. There were only 15 cottager families, but there were also 2 mills. And we can contrast that with the neighbouring manor of Crampton, just about a mile away. That was a royal manor with a minster church. There were 44 villagers living there, as well as 54 smallholders, 11 slaves and 30 other people. In Anglo-Saxon times, Crampton was the main settlement in the area, giving its name to the 100 that covered a large part of the district. But William de Mohun decided to build a castle at Dunster, and he made it his caput, his headquarters, and the totality of all of his manors became known as the Honour of Dunster. The original keep was built on the hill above the site of the present castle. You can just see that there's a flat area through the trees on the skyline to the right. Here's an artist's impression of what the early Motte and Bailey arrangement might have looked like, the keep on the top of a scarped hill. At first, it would undoubtedly have been a wooden structure, but we know from records that by 1138, there were stone fortifications here. And there was other substantial building work going on in Dunster at the same time.
In 1090, William de Mohun gave the neighbouring manor of Orcombe and some other lands to Bath Abbey so that they should build and raise a church in Dunster. And we know that by 1150, there was building work going on here, both for the church and for a small priory. Evidence of that early church still exists in this restored Romanesque door. This is the west door of the church. But I'm not going to say any more about that today, because that's going to be the subject of Jerry Sampson's talk next week.
So less than 100 years after the conquest, Dunster is growing in size and importance. With the castle would come a garrison, and lay people would arrive with the church and the priory, along with artisans and traders and all their families. Crampton was gradually eclipsed. In fact, it became part of the de Mohun lands before 1150. Contemporary documents tell us that by 1197, Dunster was described as a borough, and before 1222, it was holding a weekly market. Although it dates from much later, we can see here on the tithe map the cluster of buildings surrounding the foot of the castle and church that may be the pattern of early settlement. There's good reason to think that the original marketplace may not have been in the High Street, but here at the top of West Street at Spears Cross. A number of house surveys have been carried out here and in Church Street. Though they may look very different from the outside, many of these houses internally have evidence of being medieval hall houses dating from the 14th century. If we look a bit more closely at the tithe map, we can see evidence of that in property boundaries. What we can see here are what's known as burgage plots. This is typical of medieval town development, a form of early urban planning. Plots of land were leased to artisans and merchants to build workshops and dwelling houses, usually fronting onto a marketplace. The long strip of land behind gave room for more workspace, but also to grow some produce and maybe even keep a pig. But essentially, this was intended as a commercial venture and not a small holding. The leaseholders were known as burgesses, and they paid a money rent to the lord of the manor, rather than owing labour or other services, as in a feudal arrangement. They also had rights on common land and the right to pass on their title to the tenement, but they also had obligations to take responsibility in the affairs of the town. We can see this as a win-win situation. Artisans have time to pursue their trade and benefit from being in proximity to one another and to their customers. And the lord gets the revenue from the burgage rents, although typically that was very low, a penny a month was the standard, without being responsible for things like property maintenance. And as the market grows, the lord also gets more and more money from the tolls. In short, the town becomes more prosperous. The de Mohun family retained feudal ownership of the honour of Dunster for over 300 years. The last of them, at least as far as Dunster is concerned, was John de Mohun, born in 1320. He was an important sort of chap who fought alongside Edward III at the Battle of Crecy, and he was one of the original 25 Knights of the Garter. But unfortunately, he and his ambitious wife Joan lived well beyond their means at court, selling and mortgaging a lot of their hereditary lands to fund their lifestyle. Eventually, and contentiously, Joan sold the manors of Dunster and Minehead and Carampton to Lady Elizabeth Luttrell for 5,000 marks, which is about £3,000. Contentiously, because her husband John wasn't actually dead when she made the sale, and after her death, her daughters contested her right to have sold the manors. It wasn't until 1407 that Hugh Lutzer, the son of Elizabeth, finally secured title to the estate. Now, Hugh was another important chap in his way. He started his career as an esquire to John of Gaunt, and he saw diplomatic and military service under Henry IV and Henry V. And in 1420, he was made Seneschal of Normandy and Lieutenant of Harfleur. So for him, ownership of the honour of Dunster wasn't really about the land and so on. It was about the honour of a feudal baronry. As if to stamp his ownership and interest, Hugh Lutzer quickly built a magnificent new gatehouse, which still stands and is one of the oldest parts of the present castle buildings. I'm pleased to tell you now about a late addition to our talks programme. On the 31st of October, Isabel Richardson will be here online to tell us about the early Dunster Project survey of the gatehouse that was carried out this time last year. So reverting to Hugh, there are records from around 1420 about the Luttrells building the first jutty or pier at the quay in Minehead. So it shows another example of their interest in the area, perhaps in an expanding trade, or maybe they were just trying to make travel to Harfleur a bit easier. As far as Dunster is concerned, leases and other documents from this time show that there was lots of development and commercial activity going on. The marketplace by now was definitely in the present High Street. It's often referred to in the records of this time as Chipping Street, as a medieval term for a long market square. The earliest recorded public houses, Yeola's Tavern and Trott's Tavern, pop up in 1436. And then in 1463, we find the lease for the George, which can also almost certainly be identified as what is now the 12 to 14 High Street, and was an inn right up until the 1870s. So we're rapidly appointing our starting point, the 11th of May 1500. Dunster's weekly market was the biggest in the area for domestic goods and for grain and livestock. Leland visited the town during his itinerary in the 1540s, and he noted that there is a very celebrate market in Dunster once a week. But he also said, the town of Dunster maketh cloth. Manufacture and trading in woolen cloth was a major factor in Dunster's wealth in the medieval period.
So we're at the south end of Little Lane now, and the pair of cottages behind me here became the village's poorhouse in 1760. But at the bottom of the garden and the gardens of the cottages further down the street runs the Leach, the mill stream, and we think this is probably where Dunster's early medieval filling mills were sited.
Fulling is a process of washing and beating newly woven woolen cloth to both clean and thicken it. The process shrinks the cloth, and so afterwards it has to be stretched and reshaped on drying racks, which were called tenters. And if you have a feeling of being on tenterhooks, it might possibly be because you're being hung out to dry. Fulling is an ancient process originally done by hand or more usually by foot, but by the 10th century in Europe, watermills were being used to drive wooden hammers to beat the cloth. The first record we have mentioning a fulling mill in Dunster is from 1259, and in the early 15th century there were at least 4 known to have been in operation here. The cloth that was made here was a lightweight open weave type known as kersey. It was usually dyed blue, and the finished bale of cloth of specified length and quality was known as a dunster. Local wool from Exmoor would have been used in production, but shipping records show that much of the wool was imported from Wales as well, and some from Ireland. And it was traded internationally. There are records, for example, of Spanish ships laden with dunsters leaving Bridgewater port in the 1530s. The mills were, and still are, fed by the Leat, the mill stream, which starts up about 1 kilometre upstream at the Hurleypool. Nowadays it rejoins the River Avel after passing over twin wills at Dunster Watermill. We don't know how old the Leat is, but there is enough continuity in the documents to suggest that the present day mill is in roughly the same place as those 2 mills that were mentioned in Domesday, in which case the Leat may also be as old and following the same path. In 1582, the estate was inherited by George Lutzer. For the previous 100 years and more, the family hadn't actually lived at Dunster. The manor house at East Quantock's was their main residence, and what was left of the old castle buildings was by this time in a poor state of repair. George Lutzer embarked on a major rebuilding project. To the design of Somerset architect William Arnold, he built a Jacobean mansion in the lower ward, much of which forms the core of the building we know today. He took a lot of interest in local affairs and the development of trades. He raised funds to build the first stone pier in Minehead, which was completed in 1622 and was declared by a visiting Frenchman to be the most beautiful pier in the world. And he was responsible for building Dunster's. So I'm sorry, I do beg your pardon, everyone. We skipped a slide there. This is an artist's impression of the castle as it was after George Lutzer had rebuilt it. So we'll move on now. He was responsible. At least you know we're doing this live when you see that kind of glitch. So George Lutzer was also responsible for building Dunster's iconic Young Market, probably around 1600. Dates in the record do vary about that. And what's also not clear is whether it was actually originally intended as cloth market. It might actually have been used for butter and cheese. The yarn in the name only starts to be used in the 19th century. Now, the yarn market is a good place to take us into the 17th century, which was, of course, dominated by the English Civil War. Thomas Luttrell, who was the son of George, initially supported the parliamentary side, but he was persuaded to switch to the royalists. And over the winter of 1645-6, the castle was besieged by parliamentary troops led by Colonel Robert Blake. It's said that the officers lodged in what is now the Luttrell Arms and was then called the Ship Inn. The troops attempted to dig tunnels to undermine the castle walls, and the ridge beyond the pottery kiln was probably raised at that time for firing cannon. After holding out for 6 months, the royalists were granted an honourable surrender in 1646. Oliver Cromwell had ordered that all royalist-held castles should be razed to the ground to reduce the risk of insurrection. But in Dunster's case, only the only the outer walls were demolished, and the gatehouse was left standing. The town suffered extensive damage from cannon shot and fire during the siege, and the yarn market actually had to be rebuilt. And Minehead was also affected. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the port was used to transport troops to Ireland. Ships were commandeered, and trade inevitably suffered. There's evidence that the local cloth trade recovered to some extent towards the end of the 17th century, but within a few decades it was in permanent decline. The reasons aren't entirely clear, but changes in markets and increasing mechanised processes in the north of England meant that the wool industry in Dunster and surrounding area was left behind. And in 1746, an estate survey carried out by the trustees of the heiress Margaret Luttrell said that Hossom's fulling mill couldn't be let. It was of no value owing to the badness of trade. And there were only 5 drying racks in use, whereas there'd been a dozen 20 years earlier. The same survey records little shops of no value, a house in ruins, and we know from the land tax records, for example, that pattern continued throughout the 18th century. The number of baptisms, marriages and burials recorded in the parish registers suggests that the population may have actually halved during the course of the century. And in 1791, the historian John Collinson wrote that the principal street is blocked up in the middle by an old market cross and a long range of old ruinous shambles. So this rather bleak print of the High Street in 1800 is a sorry spectacle compared with the bustling market 300 years before. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. In 1747, Margaret Luttrell married Henry Fownes, a prosperous young man from Devon. As well as taking the Luttrell surname, the marriage settlement said that they must also live here for 6 months of each year, and so they set about making some improvements according to their taste. They made significant alterations to the interior of Dunster Castle, redecorating and redesigning it in the Rococo style, and even introducing this newfangled thing called wallpaper. They had the lower ward of the castle grounds reduced to one level to improve access. This is a print of an etching by Turner made in 1800, and it shows the new plan of the castle at that time. They wanted to surround themselves with the type of classical landscape typical in paintings of the time. This Italianate bridge across the River Avil is a fine example. They arranged for the deer park to be moved from Marshwood so that deer could be seen from the house. They built the pottery kiln. They renovated the grain mill. But probably the best known of their improvements is Coniger Tower, now a landmark for miles around, but built originally as a folly just to enhance the view. Now, Margaret Luttrell, incidentally, was quite an accomplished amateur artist. Here's one of her paintings, a view of an imaginary castle with a round tower. These 18th century alterations to the estate are often spoken about as though they were Henry's ideas. But having seen this painting by Margaret, I think she might have had something to say about it too. So all this work would have brought employment, and there's evidence in the land tax and lease records from the time that there was still plenty of economic activity going on at the time. It's easy to overstate perhaps the severity of decline. This is Dunster's entry in Holden's commercial directory for 1811, and if we look a bit at the detail, we can see all sorts of trades represented: cordwainer, collar maker, currier, corn factor. So no more fullers and weavers here, but trades typical of a rural hub. And around this time, we start to see other developments that weren't just for the rich man and his castle, but also benefited the poor man at the gate. The Minehead and Bampton Turnpike Trust was formed in 1765. Though roads through the centre of Dunster itself weren't altered very much at first, heavy wagons toiled up and down St Thomas Street on the way to Minehead, and it became known as Rattle Row. But in 1825, the road we now know as the main way into the village from the A39, Dunster Steep, was constructed, and around the same time, the old ruinous shambles and the courthouse were demolished, and the Buttercross moved out of the way of the traffic. Education was also on the agenda. In 1818, the Dunster curate noted that the parish has no school and the poorer classes would be grateful for an education. And in 1825, a legacy of £800 enabled the opening of Wesleyan Day School in West Street. The Methodists were very active in the district, actually, around about this time. And this was followed in 1846 by the Church of England supported charity school, situated in what is now Locke's Tea Room in the High Street. They took in infants as young as 3 and ran evening classes for older children who hadn't had a basic education. The National School, now the village's popular and thriving first school, was opened in 1872. It's a listed building. The architect was St Auban, who's better known as a Victorian church restorer. School records show that absenteeism was always a problem. Parents needed their children's labour, and holidays were regularly given for local events such as Dunster Market and harvesting and work picking. In 1857, a new police station and magistrate court was built, now a familiar sight on the A39. And 1867 saw the opening of Dunster and Minehead District Hospital in a house above West Street, known as Happy Valley. Incidentally, this is where the drying racks used to be in the days of the fulling mills. The hospital was paid for and maintained by subscription and was one of the first village hospitals catering for patients from across the district. It was operational until 1921, when the service moved to the new hospital in Minehead, and it's now a private house. 1867 was also the year that George Fownes Luttrell inherited the estate. He was responsible for a major makeover of Dunster Castle, introducing an up-to-date kitchen and piped water to bathrooms. The facade of the castle we see now is mainly the 1870s creation of the architect Anthony Salvin, who's famous for neo-Gothic elaboration of such places as the Tower of London and Windsor Castle. The alterations cost £25,000, but the underlying structure is still the large Jacobean house built by the first George Luttrell. George Fownes also commissioned and largely paid for extensive restoration of the parish church in the 1870s, but once again, I'm not going to say any more about that because it will be the subject of next week's talk. In 1874, the West Somerset Railway was extended from Watchet to Minehead with a station at Dunster. With the growing enthusiasm for seaside holidays and day trips, Minehead was being developed into a holiday resort town under the watchful eye of the Luttrells, who owned much of the development land. All these changes brought jobs and prosperity to the area, and the population began to grow again. But although, for example, the castle opened its gardens to visitors and the proceeds used to support the district hospital, many of the changes associated with tourism passed Dunster by until well into the 20th century. It remained primarily an agricultural community. The annual Christmas cattle fair was held here in the High Street until 1925, and even today, the annual Dunster show is a highlight in the local calendar. When the Dunster estate was sold in 1951, the business listed in the sale catalogue included a smithy, a saddlery, a builder's yard, a coal merchant, a butcher, a tailor's, a couple of grocers and a chemist. With a newsagent, a post office and a visiting bank, the village was virtually self-sufficient. All that changed rapidly from the 1960s onwards. Increased leisure time and mobility, changes in shopping habits, holiday homes, but perhaps most of all, for Dunster, taking over the castle by the National Trust, means that tourism is now the very centre of our economy. But at least we do now have some traffic lights.
Thank you, Barbara. That was really interesting. I really enjoyed it. Don't forget, if you want to ask questions, you just go down to the Q&A button at the bottom of your page and you can type in anything you feel you need to know. We have one question come up, which is lovely. Here we go. Somebody would like to know, is there any information from the 14th century for Dunster? Do we have any idea about the impact of the Black Death? And are there any poll tax records from the reign of Richard II? Okay, so there's a few questions there. How much information do you have from the 14th century, Barbara?
I can't answer that. It's something I've wondered about the Black Death, and there doesn't seem to be much information about it. I think one of the problems at that time, this is the time when John de Mohun and Joan were at court. We're talking about sort of 1350. Black Death is 1348, isn't it? So the focus, basically what I'm trying to say is that the de Mohuns weren't here, and the activity in the estate was in the hands of the stewards, and I don't think we've got any detailed information at all that tells us what happened with the Black Death. And I don't think we've got poll tax records from Richard II either. But I will follow that up if I can, and we can maybe answer it. Can we post an answer on the website or give a?
Yes, we could put some information on the website. Yeah.
I don't think, but I'm not sure that we're going to find all that much, but we'll have a look. Yeah.
Brilliant. That's great. And somebody here said they want to. Did you say a travelling bank? Were you talking about a travelling bank? Or
there was a visiting bank. I think this was right up until the 1980s. There was in the Memorial Hall, Lloyd's Bank, I believe it was, came once a week. And yeah, so yeah, if you needed a bank, you didn't have to go into Minehead. Well, yeah.
Is there a bank in Dunster now? No, not since the 1980s. No. But there's certainly records in the commercial records from the commercial directories show that there were banks here in the 19th century, or branches of banks. Yeah. How long has this travelling bank been going on?
No, it's a visiting bank. It was common. This was quite common in small rural towns, that you'd have a room set aside one day a week that the bank would cut. You know, they wouldn't be here permanently, but there'd be a day when the bank would be open here. That was quite common, I believe.
Oh right, how interesting.
Yeah.
And one of the things I was wanting to ask you myself was about the port. I was really interested when you say that Minehead, they started putting a port there in the middle of the 15th century.
Yeah, there was probably some sort of port there before that, but when the Luttrells came here, they decided they wanted some kind of pier, a jutty it's called, which we would understand now as jetty. So that was a wooden structure, and they built that at Minehead rather than Dunster, possibly because there was a safer. The tide was probably less of a problem there. There was a port at Dunster, going well back into medieval times. We know that for sure. But the Luttrells decided to expand the port facility in Minehead rather than at the Haven in Dunster.
Yes, that's because it can't be a very good place to have a port down at Haunt, can it? Because It's
a little bit exposed out onto the
and there must have been shifting tides and things like that, which must have caused quite a lot of havoc, I would have thought.
Yeah. How are we doing for time? Do we what?
Fine. Yeah. I've got another question for you. So,
okay.
Somebody would like to know about the village hospital. If there's any articles or resources. Hello?
I'm not aware of anything other than what's in. One of the best books to read about that is Hilary Binding's History of Dunster. She talks a lot about the hospital. I don't know where the records for the hospital would be. Who would have them? Presumably, they would have ended up as part of Minehead Hospital's records. But I don't know how to access the records for that. If somebody else can, because it's a question that's come up in the context of something else. So if anybody knows the answer to that, I'd be really pleased to find out. But yeah, I mean, Hilary Binding talks about it to some extent, but there's no great details about it.
Fantastic. And I remember just recently talking to somebody, and they said they'd found some Roman pottery on the beach. Do you know anything about the Roman pottery on the beach?
I can tell you about that. First of all, to tell you, if you want to see it, the place to go is Dunster Museum in the Memorial Hall. There's lots of pottery, of the Roman pottery on display there. So that was found by we're going back about 5 years. Phil and Ruth Webber were neighbours of mine and part of the Archaeology Society here. They were walking along the beach. There'd been quite a high tide, and so some little bits of the low cliffs have been washed away, and they spotted some pottery in the bank. And it so happened that this is round about the time that Time Team were here doing some digs in the village, and their pottery expert looked at it straight away, said this is Roman. And I'm not just talking about a few shards, we're talking about identifiable pots. Phil is absolutely brilliant at spotting this. He would go down and say, I found some more. Most of it is local. It's probably fairly locally made, your average common or garden Roman pot. But there's some Samian ware amongst it as well, and we still don't really know what that means, but what's come up this year is the possibility of Roman ironworkings at the other end of the horn. We found shards, what do you call them? I can't think of the word.
Yeah, shards.
It's with an S. Lumps of the bits that are left, the ironworking.
Oh right, yes.
And there was some pottery was found on that same site back in 1855. Actually, was part of the original SANHS collection of pot, but unfortunately, it can't be traced now. So we're hoping to be able to do a bit more work at that end of the horn. So this has come as a bit of a surprise that there appears to have been more Roman activity in this area than anybody believed at all, but because of recent findings.
There's a hill fort nearby, isn't there? Up behind.
Yeah, there's an Iron Age. Well, there are several Iron Age hill forts up on the hills behind us, Bats Castle. And there's one that's called the Roman Camp, not because Romans were there, but some Roman coins were found there some time ago, which was one of the few traces of Roman finds in this area. But more is coming to light down by the coast.
I've got some more information coming here through Minehead Hospital. Apparently there's something in the museum about the hospital. And somebody's doing a project on Dunster Hospital, and we'll put the information on her website.
Excellent.
So the hospital records are at the Somerset Archives, but the book with patients' names in only covers a small time span, and she's transcribing it, this person.
Excellent. Oh, that's really good. Yeah.
Statistics.
Yeah.
Okay, well. And somebody would like to know, you talked about there being a Wesleyan school. Was there a Methodist chapel as well?
Yes, indeed. Yeah. We did actually, one of the film clips that was looked at West Street, that went past what was the Methodist chapel.
Yes.
That chapel, I think that was built in 1876, but the maps show that there was an earlier one there before, and it was in use until, as a Methodist chapel, I think until in the 1960s. Right. And interestingly, the children from the school used to go there for their, that's where they went for their school lunches. So they went to the chapel for their school lunches during the weekdays, and then to Sunday school there at the weekends. So, I just my personal interest in that chapel is that my great grandparents were married there in 1891. So yeah, so and that's that building is at the top of West Street.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, and very several kind people have just mentioned that the remains of ironworking are called slag. I knew that really.
No, there's another word.
Is there? Right.
Yeah. Probably a word that probably means slag, but it's I can't think what it still hasn't come to me. I'll remember as soon as we go offline. I'll remember it. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and
scoriae. That's it. They've got it. Scoriae.
Scoriae, right.
Scoriae. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, and the same person who has a website about Dunster Hospital has also discovered some private schools in Dunster in the late 1800s.
Yeah, that's right. And into the 19th century, the house, if you're going up towards the castle from the high street, the house there's a tall house on the left-hand side, 3-storey house. That was a private school, a ladies' seminary, right up until I think the 1850s. And there was also one towards the end of, halfway down West Street, was a private school around about 1830, 1840 that took in. That one had seemed to have fairly local borders in it, but the one in the high street had young girls from all over the place. So it always makes me think of the Bronte sisters and so on when I read of these ladies' seminaries. Yeah. So there were certainly 2 here that are in the census records. Have got details of those.
Excellent. So I think that's probably about done for today, isn't it? Don't forget that next Saturday, the 3rd of October at 2 o'clock, there'll be a lecture by church historian Jerry Sampson and hosted by Shirley Blaylock next week. Jerry will be talking about the Dunster Priory, and you'll be able to access that talk with the same link that you used for this one. On Saturday, the 17th of October, so missing a week there, we have a lecture by Nat Alcock, timber frame expert. And on Saturday, the 24th of October, Mary Ewing, the project manager for the Dunster Project, will also be giving a lecture. And we can now announce that there will be an extra talk at the end of the original run of talks, so there will be more details to follow on that soon. Further information is, of course, available on the SANHS website and also on the Somerset Archaeology and Natural History Facebook page. So, thank you all for coming along. Lovely to have a wonderful talker. It was a really interesting talk by Barbara, and we will see you all next week. Bye.